So one of the wonderful things about living in the United States is the freedom we enjoy. And it's truly a beautiful gift that has been built upon the sacrifice of many men and women who have fought for it throughout our history. And just a few weeks ago, I got to experience many people exercising that freedom. I got to accompany almost 500 young men and women on a trip to the March for Life, in which, because of their freedom, they were able to march against an immoral law. I loved seeing them stand up so passionately for that. Because freedom is truly a beautiful thing, but it is something that can be often misunderstood. For many in our country, especially in our current age, they believe that freedom is simply the desire to follow one's passions and desires wherever it may take them. And while following one's passion and desires is an exercise of our free will, it is not the deeper freedom that Christ is calling you and I to follow today. Because Christ is calling you and I to follow a deeper, true freedom that truly frees you and I. And this freedom is something that many of us don't quite understand, but it is something that has been taught in the history of our church. Because almost 1,000 years ago, St. Thomas Aquinas made this very important distinction, in which he distinguished between freedom of choice versus freedom for excellence. And while to many of us there may not seem to be much of a distinction between those two, there is a very, very important distinction. It gets to the heart of today's gospel. Because freedom of choice is the ability to choose what we want to do when we want to do it. Basically, following one's passions and desires to whatever end they may be. And of course, many of us can already see the error with that line of thinking. Whereas freedom of excellence is the freedom for excellence, is the realization that true freedom lies in choosing the good, which is always the will of God. And what separates these two apart is what really gets to the heart of what it means to be truly free. And I'd like to use an example from our gospel to help explain this. In the gospel, Jesus takes the commandment, thou shalt not kill, and really takes it not just one, but several steps further for us to understand what it is that he is calling us to, that life of freedom. He says, anyone who is angry with his brother is liable to judgment. Anyone who says Raka is liable to Sanhedrin, and anyone who calls his brother an idiot is liable to Gehenna. Very, very strong words, aren't they? I mean, take a moment to let that sink in. I think that really, really takes the commandment to a whole nother level. Because Jesus, through this, is calling us to freedom. Because Jesus is not saying that there aren't times when you and I become frustrated in our lives, in which something may kind of get our blood going, should we say, for lack of a better term. And that's a purely human response. What Jesus is really getting to is what is going on in our heart in the midst of that. And that really gets to the distinction between freedom of choice versus freedom for excellence. Because in that moment, those who are striving for that true, authentic freedom, that freedom for excellence, will be doing a very, very important thing. They will be asking themselves, how can I love my neighbor in the midst of this frustration that they are causing? Of course, it's oftentimes in forgiveness, in letting go of those emotions. Whereas those who are struggling with simply freedom of choice will be following their passions and their desires and finding themselves getting more and more frustrated, more and more angry. Because what separates freedom of choice from freedom for excellence is the call to authentic love. Whereas if somebody is solely driven by their passions or their emotions, they actually become slaves to those passions, slaves to those emotions, and don't allow grace and virtue to dictate how they respond. Whereas somebody who is struggling with freedom of choice, or freedom for excellence, is following Christ's call to be a disciple. Their decisions become based on the call of Christ to love. The call that Jesus is bringing to us today by all those many images in the gospel is not because he's trying to give us all a guilt trip, but he's trying to show us what it means to be free, the kind of life that you and I are called to live, and the decisions that we can make in the midst of those situations that we find ourselves in. And it's not an easy calling, not in any way, because none of us are perfect. We all make mistakes. Yet I always say God's mercy is greater. For by heeding the call that Jesus calls you and I to today to love, we are exercising freedom as it was meant to be. By doing so, we are becoming more free because we become who Christ created us to be. We are becoming those vessels of his love. And so you and I today must heed that calling. Distinguished from freedom of choice, in which we become slaves of passion, slaves of desires, versus freedom for excellence, in which we are truly free in order to be able to love our brothers and sisters.